Now we're just coming back very quick. This is the part 2 of our Lent and Easter video recording session from our freestyle lectures of the Ministry of Spirituology's YouTube channel. If you're just joining us, I am the Naturalist Minister, the Nka'laa of Bafut, Nkanwi Foko Ambe, the Initiator of the Ministry of Spirituology, and the Director of the Association for Cultural Awareness. And this is the part 2 of a segment in discourse we are doing on Lent and Easter. And in our part 1, we were just laying some of the foundation and background for the understanding of how Lent actually evolved from the more ancient agrarian practices of, several ancient cultures and tribes and traditions. Generally, our ancestors were animist people, and they recognized the forces of nature, being pantheist, and personified them and gave them archetypal representations, which allowed them now to give a code and explanation and calculation of how the sun, stars, and planets were moving in relation to the earth, so that they would know when to plant and harvest their food and essentially survive. And this became the basis of mythologies, which even the Christian church adapted its form of Jesus Christ as a teaching to fit in on top of. And that is what we start to realize as we're going to follow in our discourse and get deeper into the notes and information that we have prepared. So just like we were explaining to you, it was about 40 days of preparation for the peak of the planting season. That's what Lent was about. And if you get into the Auser, Auset, Heru, and Set myth, Set actually kills Auser, and Auset resurrects him and uses his phallus to give birth to Heru. Now, I have to get into this myth in a little bit more detail, because Set is the brother of Auser in this Khmt mythology, and Set is an archetype that symbolizes darkness. Now, Auser, he symbolizes the resurrective or regenerative forces of the planet. In the Greek mythology, he's equivalent to Osiris, and he's called the god of agriculture. Auset is equivalent to Isis today, or Ishtar, and she is referred to as the goddess of fertility, but she is an archetype that represents life force. That's how we would say it in the Ministry of Spirituology, because when we talk of gods and goddesses, like we said in the video on God and Goddess, who is God, what is God, it's ambiguous. Now, we also pointed out that there's Heru, which is the child of light, their son, who is normally depicted with the falcon head, not because they worshipped bird-headed or animal-headed gods, but because, the sun being in the sky was represented by the falcon, which was a majestic bird which also flew high in the sky. You get it? So that's the symbolic representation. You need to start to understand that our ancestors did not worship gods, G-O-D-S. You see it? They had a symbolic archetypal system which allowed them to harmonize and understand reality and interpret it from a deep, like an understanding perspective. That's why I keep using that word. You see it, because they had I don't want to use the word personified view, but they had a very personal, direct relationship with nature. You get it? So that's why they would draw Ra as the sun god, and then say this, someone would get the idea and think this is the sun god, but it's an archetype, it's a principle representing the sun that is shaped like a man, that has a head that is symbolic like this, and has these reasons attached to it that let us know that this is why it's, we represent it, feeling it in us as we have a harmonized relationship to the sun. That's what they'll be seeing when they see the archetype of Ra. That's how I feel it, you see, as a Khmetic priest. And I understand this. Now, of course, the European or Caucasian would come later and read this and say, oh, these people worshipped Ra. They worshipped Heru. They worshipped these gods with animal heads and different heads. But no, that's not the truth. Let me just even give you a clear example. If you come to the Ngemba Tikari tribes of the grasslands of Cameroon, in Central West Africa, or even in General West Africa, you see that they have what is called the masquerade, what the Frenchman called the juju, which is the individuals, men or women, who take on certain spirits and then wear masks. and perform parades or processions to represent certain entities, spirits, kings or queens or ancestors who have passed away. Now these masks they're wearing is the same mask representation that was done in Khmt. It's the same spiritual tradition that's been handed down through migrations, but our people just don't want to quickly recognize it because the European man wants to give the impression that the Kemetic tradition and what would be Yoruba, Ife, or the traditions in West Africa are not the same, but they're entirely the same. It's the same people. They were all dominant melanated people, irregardless of how he wants to classify them. So I don't want to get into too much of that deviation. We're in an entirely different video. We're talking about the Auset Heru and Set myth and how Set, their darkness kills the regenerative forces of the planet, causing agricultural harvesting and growth to die. You see it, such that Auset, the life force, has to resurrect the regenerative forces of the earth, which is, symbolically called Auser or Osiris. Now Set dismembers the regenerative force or Osiris, cutting it into 13 parts and spreading it throughout the entire land. And Auset now has to search for these 13 body pieces, including the phallus or the penis, to join them back together. And while she's searching for these body pieces, which Set has cut up, and remember, Auset and Osiris or Auset and Auser, it's husband and wife. You see male and female. It's a polarization that they're trying to create. Not that this is actually what was truly believed by the ancestors. It's all symbolic. Like I say, it's all archetypal. But what it's bringing you out to believe is that we have a period where there's not going to be any food that will grow, and then it will die, and then it will have to grow back. And it's the regenerative forces of the planet that come and help the food to grow back. Clearly, that's what they're explaining in the Auset, Seti, Heru mythos, and then how when this period of mourning that they're talking about called Lent today was what during the period when they knew that Auset was searching for the 13 body parts of Auser, that the people could perform the theatric pageantry during that period, in which they also did the mourning with her, and they also anointing themselves with ash cloths. Some people would remove their robes and wear sackcloths and all of that stuff. I mean, it's an ancient tradition that was practiced amongst the ancient Khmetai or the ancient Khmet Egyptians. I mean, before like 2600 BCE. It's also a practice that was kept by the ancient Sumerians. Now, if we actually read in Ezekiel chapter 8, verses 14 to 15, there's a lamentation which the prophet Ezekiel is taken up in a vision by an angel, right? And in the discourse of these verses, it comes out that there's a lamentation given that the Israelites were weeping for Tammuz. Now, Tammuz takes us into the Sumer Babylonian mythology specifically, and this is an archetype which specifically was killed by a wild boar, a wild pig. And when he was killed by a wild pig, you see it, though some traditions speak of a Semiramis, in the Babylonian tradition, Semiramis is actually a queen who was elevated to being equal to Ishtar. So Ishtar somehow is like a consort or has a relationship to Tammuz, in which when Tammuz is slain by this wild boar which he's hunting, she goes out now also, and in a sequence seeking for his body now, there is also a 40 days of weeping for Tammuz, which is also practiced, over 2,000 years before the coming of Jesus Christ, which also coincided with this period of the resurrection, which is also denoted and still in this tradition with being the first Sunday following the first full moon after the vernal equinox of that year, because that is what we've centrally recognized the resurrection of Jesus Christ in the Roman tradition still to keep. So like I said, it's the astrotheology, it's the astrology, it's the astronomy, the spiritology, the spirituology, as Joyce to point out, and that's what our ministry does. So that's why I had to give you that brief pause to look at it, because this church went around calling us naturalist pagan and saying that our practices and traditions were evil and vile. It killed our people, murdered us. Our pageantries now are gone. We were defiled. But then they still keep our traditions today, but call them by different names. So it's necessary that our ministry has to step forward and start to make these declarations, especially for the African continent, so that our people who are on this path of awakening can come to this awareness, especially when it comes to this idea of things like Lent and Easter. You see it. Our ministry is not going to come out and speak and say that, oh, the church is keeping pagan traditions and it's wrong. We're telling you that it was originally not even wrong to be practicing what they called pagan because it was naturalist now. You see it. And this is where the error is, because there's clash, and African traditions, Celtic traditions, you see it, ancient European tribes and their traditions, Native American tribes and their traditions, you see it, Aboriginal tribes, Asian traditions, you see it, Arabian, so many traditions on the planet have been lost, been derogated because of what the Roman Catholic Church has gone out on the planet and has done. And we think that actually it is high time that those of us, the people of the earth, the saints, the naturalists, you see it, we stand up and start to speak affirmatively, logically, and rationally on behalf of our traditions, of course, being recognized in equality on the planet in the interest of interfaith development and growth. Because it's just one thing. Even if we want to start speaking of the resurrection of Jesus, you see it, the whole idea of the Passover of Nisan 14. We know that there was conflict, like I started pointing out in the early introduction, in which we had individuals who, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this right, the Quartodecimanism. You see it, there were Quartodecimanists, which were individuals who were in conflict with whether there should be keeping of the resurrection of Jesus Christ on Nisan 14, which is the day it would have had to synchronize with if it was to keep with the Hebrew or the Jewish calendar, as opposed to what was being kept with the Roman calendar. And there's a lot of argument that follows this. You see it because when they want to start even establishing what specifically is the day for the resurrection, there's an argument over whether the 3 days and 3 nights, of which specifically they say in the scriptural narrative, the man Jesus Christ spoke of himself as being the amount and period of which he would actually be dead before he was resurrecting. It specifically, the argument is that it stipulates that it would have been a Wednesday and not a Good Friday specifically, that he would have actually had to have been killed on for him to resurrect in time for the sequence to fit with what they're actually stipulating, because they're saying that if he was in the grave on Wednesday before sunset, then that would mean that he would have to resurrect at the end of Saturday at sunset, because it's sunset to sunset, not dawn to dawn, to give a day in the Jewish tradition. If you read even in the book of Genesis, you see it, they say that it's from sunset to sunset that the days are calculated, not from dawn to dawn as we do now with the modern British systems. You see it. So that week they said that there was 2 Sabbaths, a Passover and a Saturday Sabbath, which actually occurred within that week, which give you the fitting for this Nisan 14 Pesach day to represent the specific day that Jesus Christ now would have had to have been crucified and resurrected, and all of that period commenced inside of that week before it would make sense. But I mean, like I said, I'm not trying to get into the depths of Christian theology and the conflicts that they might have. We're just trying to look at the origins and some of the general history and background of the Lent and Easter concept in relation to the naturalist teachings of the Ministry of Spirituology, so that we have a more enlightened perspective of what this period means to individuals who are practicing it in its celestial relationship to their tradition and to ourselves as individual souls. Now, just rounding up, because we don't have a lot of time, truthfully, we're just coming now to the procession of the Vernal Equinox, which this year was set at March 20th, 2021. Now, the Vernal Equinox marks the first astronomical day of spring in the northern hemisphere. It indicates that the planting season, or the regrowth of vegetation, specifically agricultural cycle, or more essentially the set trade cycle, because from the ancient times, agriculture crops would have been harvested and sold. And this would, of course, have stipulated now the trade cycle, which has evolved now into the modern civil status cycle that we follow today under the Roman system. Now, civilization follows the order of the sun, moon, and stars, essentially. That's what this entire recording should have brought you to an understanding of. And if this is pagan, it is just scientific cosmology. The church plagiarized our ancestors. Matter of fact, that's what we have to start rounding up in conclusion and understanding. Now, it's wrong because when you plagiarize, you don't give credit to the individuals who started what you are using. And that's where we want to come into having a complaint with what has been done. You see it? Because Easter, Ishtar, Auset, I said it is Naturalist. That's Khmt. That's Sumerian. That's Germanic. You see it? It's even Judaic if they want to give respect to where the origins came from, that it treats the recognition of the vernal equinox and the planting and gestation cycle of the planet coming back to its peak of fertility. You see, do they want to accept that, or they want to insist on their Passover and their God coming and, passing over, killing a bunch of people in Egypt, creating this type of a tradition based on sadism and violence and murder, which must always be projected upon the other tribes of the earth. It's nationalist, I guess it's Zionism, but it's something that, though it's valuable as a nationalist concept to a particular tribe within the context of their state, it seems to impede on the right to self-determination, the right to nationalism of other peoples, and for peace to be upon the earth. I do think that at times, a lot of these religious teachings which enforce this idea of being chosen and one tradition being above another, or these people being above another, you see, these are those subjective aspects of deity and God, which, like when I talked about in the last video, and I'm referring it again, are those aspects of God and theologies which are bad, which we in our Ministry of Spirituology theology, we do siphon them out in our explanations and teachings to those people who are our participants, so that they grow up with a more holistic appreciation of how they can harmonize various spiritual traditions together and see them as just being one naturally. Now, of course, that's where we need to start rounding up with this discourse on Lent and its relationship to Easter, like we did point out the 40 days and the ash, all of that. You see, it was just recognition of the attempt or the approaching resurrection of the entity which represented the regenerative forces of the earth, whether it was going to be Auser or it was going to be Tammuz or any of the other many narrative mythological entities that could have been represented as archetypes, which are now called gods and were called idols, which people want to argue whether they believed or not. And all of that is just nonsensical when you now understand that it's all cosmological astrotheology, which is understood in its truth in a symbolic light, but never in a literal light. And we understand that we never, as Kemetic priests or those who are true Kemetic initiates, never took the gods that people call them today beyond just being the archetypes or the metuneta and understood them in their symbolic representation as being keys, or like I'm saying, archetypes that can give us an explanation of natural and other mystical phenomena. Then no, we've never been confused. Our teachings were never inferior. It's just those who came and tried to understand them or understand them after failed. They've never had the code. So I hope you've been able to actually get the code in this particular teaching. You should always remember, when we're talking about this thing of Lent, it was Council of Laodicea in 360 CE, in which they decided to sit down and start making these things official festivals and holidays. Easter itself was in 325 CE. Council of Nicaea, that they actually specifically came out with what they call the Tessera Costa, which indicated that there would be penance on the eve of Easter, fasting on Good Friday, and also Ash Wednesday was set as stipulated as the day that kicks off the whole Lent moving up to the Easter session and period. You see it. And if you want to even go further, you find it very, very interesting that even the Norse tradition itself, you see, the people do also anoint their foreheads with ash for Odin, or Odin, who we spoke. This is the origins of where they got the word God from, as it's used in the English King James Version in texts. And we also did point out the idea about weeping for Tammuz, and how he was killed by a boar in the Babylonian myth. And incidentally, the fourth month of the Jewish calendar is also called Tammuz. That is something that you might also find with a bit of interest, and that the Jews themselves sacrifice a lamb in the first full moon of spring with the Passover feast. So they themselves are also keeping their Passover feast in context with the precession of the full moon, which follows after the vernal equinox of the year to denote that particular feast. So what do I have to say again? It's all naturalist. Peace profound peace.